Thank you so much. And we might now invite all of our discussants as well as our speakers onto the stage. While we're doing that, I'd ask you to reflect on whether your glass is half full or whether it's half empty. You're going to live longer, but it may not be quite the same quality of life at the end. And if you're sitting next to someone of the different gender, look at them and figure out whether they got the better deal out of this equation. I'm not telling you what the answer to that question is. So we're going to start with brief comments, very brief from our discussants, and we're going to have Duncan Selby first.
Good morning, everyone. It's designate in my title because I start in April. My life expectancy has been somewhat shortened by the prospect of being in front of you today. Hi, Sam. I do want to add to the congratulations to everyone for putting this stunning work together. It comes at just an awesomely good time for the public health system, for the health services in England. I believe you had Sir Mike Richards yesterday, and he's still buzzing from the potential that this offers us. So I have two things really to convey. The first is to say thank you. I believe also Christopher's agreed to, by Christmas Eve, analyse all of this for England, which is going to get us into a great start for planning from next April. And the second thing to convey is, or to say to you, is will you help us? I've never before been in front of a group of hundreds of researchers and scientists who are genuinely global, who know what the problems are. And the help I'm looking for is, well, of all of this, or from all of this, how do we prioritise? What should we focus on? And crucially, what can be done about it? So moving from the reporting to helping people at local level, not just nationally, but local leadership. So what can you do? What can be done about this? So I'm going to leave you with my email address. I'm also available to travel all over the world, but the email if not. And I'm absolutely authentic in saying, well, we all have to move on. Given what's just been said, we have to move on from where we've been and to rebalance from the treatment and the late intervention into prevention and early intervention. What does that look like? What does it really mean? So we're not sitting here in another 10 years' time. We've done another massively, even more impressive piece of work to understand that we haven't really done so much on the ground in addressing the problems. The global context is humbling. Some of the data for the UK, for England, is counterintuitive for me. Christopher says we're doing terribly well on diabetes. This is not something I'm hearing in England. And I'm not surprised that we're doing well on ischemic heart disease, and I'm not surprised that there's still an awful lot more to do around our cancers. And I mean both about mortality and about the burden of disease, both being important. So what will Public Health England do with this? I've written down four things. We will use this work to inform our priorities, with the NHS and with local government and with government. We'll use it to inform local leadership, political leadership and professional leadership right across England. We'll use this to hold ourselves and government to account. So, how are we actually doing? And I'm going to use it to ask you for help. And to say, get beyond. And I have to think about a diplomatic way of saying this. Give me a minute. To go beyond the reporting of it, to rolling your sleeves up and getting alongside practitioners and people about what can we practically do. How do we make sense of this in practical ways? Thank you.
Thank you. After that shameless request for pro bono assistance, let's move on. John Powell's next, please.
Thanks very much. Anticipated my co-discussants would be interested and talk mostly about the main substantive messages. I think many in the audience will probably be, like me, trying to make sense of the new iteration of the burden of disease on the basis of some knowledge of the previous iteration, and it might be useful just to say something initially about how the metric, the DALY, has been changed, and then to go on to say how this has been used in the new system. So in the old DALY, we had the quantity of healthy life lost as a sum of the losses from incident deaths plus losses from incident disease and injury. It's important to note that in the new DALY, what we've got is losses from incident deaths plus losses from prevalent disease and injury. One consequence of this is that we've lost a symmetry, as you can see, because now we're summing a stream of lost life from incident events with a proportion of the year lived that can be regarded as lost to ill health. Now, that's one of the costs. The real advantage, as has been pointed out in Chris's supplementary paper that's available online from 5 p.m. last night, and which I was able to read after dinner, is that it enables the prevalence-based YLD enables us to deal in a much more refined way with problems like comorbidity. Now, in addition to that, there has been this enormous increase in the empirical detail with which these problems have been addressed, so that we've gone from 100, as has been repeatedly said, from a small number of diseases to a number that's more than twice, and from a small number of sequelae to a number that's more than twice and now exceeds 1,000. The consequence is that we now have, as we've heard already, these very much more robust and refined accounts of health losses from non-fatal conditions. And unfortunately, the examples I was going to use have already been well illustrated by the two presentations of the speakers, but I'll say a little bit more about them. Firstly, for example, the epidemiological transition, which is often talked about in a rather loose way, as though there's going to be a tsunami, as Majid Azati has said, of non-communicable disease sweeping the world. What we see from this work is as a much more nuanced picture, it comes out much more clearly that, in fact, health losses from non-fatal conditions are relatively inelastic, and at a high level of aggregation, nearly all of the transitions so far in non-fatal health losses has been from population increase and changing age structure, and not at all from age-specific changes in the proportion of time spent unwell. So that's one message I think that's there, that in the face of a lot of very loose speculative discussion, we have here something that is much more refined and much more robust. And we can, the account of the epidemiological transition really illustrates that. Another illustration was the compression and expansion of mobility debate. As I understand it, that began with a very speculative paper by Fries in the early 80s, which just simply speculated that as health improved, we would all live happily to some vaguely defined age when our physiological systems would collapse and we'd drop off the cliff, and therefore we'd have this rectangularization of the survival curve. That would be a very sort of happy picture for health services, because the total burden of disability would be rather small, and everyone would be living to this point. Well, of course, it's of course unrealistic. I mean, the more expected picture is what we see, that in fact, yes, we're living longer, but given the much increased probability of ill health with increasing age, it's almost inevitable that the process of living longer will be associated with an increase, an expansion of morbidity, not a contraction. Now, that's the situation so far, and as Josh has emphasized at the end, we should perhaps be regarding this now as a challenge and trying to do something to actually address that. In terms of implications, as a public health educator, I think one of them is that we really need to improve the treatment of amount of education in our professional public health courses on time-based metrics in public health. Now, in Cambridge, we have a module of this in our master's course. I hope I'm wrong, but I don't know of any other master's program in public health in Britain that actually has a substantial module on time-based metrics in public health assessments. And if we look at the hundreds of introductory textbooks in epidemiology and compare that with the total of introductory textbooks in in time-based metrics for public health, that total I think is 0. There's a challenge there to improve what we're doing in public health education. Because if our public health professionals are not well versed in these methods, how on earth can we expect to make good use of them in our health services? And finally, in public health surveillance, bodies as eminent as the European Union are still using summary measures of life expectancy that rely for the morbidity component on a single question about disability, the so-called healthy life years. It's really a scandal that measures as inadequate as that are being used to compare the levels of health in the European countries at this moment. So they're my main observations. Thank you.
Thank you. And so I think that was advertising for the master's course at Cambridge, was it not? I think that's what I heard. Finally, Mickey Chopra, over to you.
Thank you, Jane, Your Excellency and notable guests. Just to start by congratulating Chris and Alan and Theo and Josh and everybody for an amazing effort. Particularly at UNICEF, as you know, we've always had a big focus on metrics of death and outcomes as being a big driver of the mission and the work we do. So we really welcome the innovation, the energy, and the attention that this series and this work is bringing to the importance of holding ourselves accountable to real meaningful outcomes and results. And we're also quite pleased to see that there is some, despite the very complex methodologies used by different groups, that in terms of numbers at the global level, we are getting some convergence, at least within the confidence intervals of the different estimates. However, I do want to sound a note of caution and a little bit that, at the country level, there still are, in some countries, quite big differences between the estimates that have been produced, and that's going to be important for how we handle that and manage that. Our own analysis of the differences is that most of it is not due to any methodological processes and differences, but most of it is due to how we manage and handle the missing data, the surveys that are out there already, and particularly in contexts where there's very little data, or in contexts of war and strife and very data-poor countries. As many of you know, only 3% of child deaths actually have specific causes recorded for them worldwide. So this is a challenge not just for many poorer countries, but also many wealthier countries. We still know relatively very little directly about the causes of, for instance, child deaths in particular. So just to re-emphasize our continual focus on improving vital registration system and household surveys. We'll be paying and investing over $100 million over the next couple of years to do at least 60 national household surveys moving forward, but really needs to be supplanted by improving the vital registration and the basic information systems in these countries. Just to turn to the specific papers, a couple of comments. We do welcome this focus on non-fatal outcomes, and particularly how they can help to highlight conditions which, when we just look at mortality, are overlooked. And for me in particular, the ones around anemia and tropical diseases and so forth, it really is an important way of bringing to policymakers the importance of these conditions which can be overlooked. But I do have some concerns about the presentation so far. One is the disability weights, and to get a better handle on how those were drawn up. And as you saw with anemia, which we know has quite severe consequences, but quite often not felt by people suffering from that condition, and you saw the very low weight that it was given in the analysis. So how do we manage and look at how these weights are derived and given? But I also have a concern around some of the potential policy responses which may result, and in particular focus on health services and the provision of treatment as opposed to looking at the risk factors and the preventive side of it. And this is relating to this paper this afternoon, but we have to be very careful in the way in which we present and look at risk factors, particularly we may well overlook some critical ones. Both direct ones, as we'll see, things such as hygiene, contraceptions, and so forth, has been overlooked in this recent analysis. But also, more critically, I suppose, is the social determinants, things which, such as gender empowerment, social inclusivity, things which are difficult to do randomized controlled trials or longitudinal surveys, and therefore the evidence base that qualifies for inclusion in these kinds of analysis is much weaker, and therefore they get put to one side. But they can have critical influence on the way that policy is formulated in looking at the results of these kinds of analysis. So I think I welcome the attention that it's going to put on some of these non-fatal conditions, but to also urge some caution in terms of how we present some of the evidence that we have or we don't have as well. I just want to turn to attention now to also some of the challenges in presentation of the overall study results as well. And in fact, Richard Horton reminded us of that whilst rates may be improving, and particularly child survival rates, it really does cover up many worsening situations. Just to give you two examples, the DRC, the child mortality rate has decreased from 181 to about 168 per 1,000 live births. But the actual number of children from 1990 to 2010, the actual number of children dying in DRC has gone from about 300,000 to 500,000 children dying in that country. Similarly, in Mali has seen quite a substantial decline in its mortality rate from 257 to 176, but a 25% increase in the number of children dying. And in both those countries, the inequities has widened. So a lot of those gains in rate has happened for particular and more better off groups of children. So just as we welcome the continuing decline and improvements in life expectancy, is to continue to scratch under the surface and to make sure that we highlight some of the critical anomalies that we're seeing. And then, Josh, finally, in terms of the healthy life expectancy, I see in your paper there is a discussion around its use for post-2015, and we welcome this focus on mortality and life expectancy as opposed to some of the more process type of indicators that have been proposed. But we do have a concern that as we move, it's interesting when I talk to people about the MDGs, particularly non-public health people, the ones that they do latch onto are the number of children not dying or the number of women not dying in delivery as the ones that they know and can recite, whereas the others are sort of forgotten as being not so well known. So people do attach to things that they can really relate to. Life expectancy is another level of complexity, but I think people can still relate to that measure, even though it is artificially created. Healthy life expectancy is going to be another leap of complexity, particularly as I said, in terms of how disabilities are weighted and calculated. So I think as we discuss indicators of post-2015, I think the work is a big step forward, and I think it should be seriously considered, though I do think we'll need to look at how we can translate this and also allow people to interpret and play with it, as Sir Richard said, so that they feel comfortable that it's meaningful and something that they can do something about as well. Thank you.
Thank you. So we've had two, I think, very interesting presentations, and then three discussants who've drawn out for us a couple of quite important points. The question of what we do with this, and then I think some quite well-pointed words about the caution and the challenge of actually getting people to a position where they understand this. And then some technical points which go to the particular technical approach, which will of itself require us to have a much clearer understanding, particularly in the policy and the program world, about what this actually means. So some very big challenges, I think, to the academic community, which I think our discussants are pointing us to. We have some time still for questions, so can I invite you to put your hand in the air? So right down the front, we'll have a microphone, please. First, second, third and fourth. We'll do the same as we did last time. We'll take 4 in a row, if we might, and then we'll get some rapid-fire responses. Can I ask you to stand and introduce yourself? And if you've got your question directed to somebody particularly, if you could indicate who that is.
So, Josh, it's a question from Richard Piso. I don't think that the way you interpret the change in life expectancy and the change in healthy life expectancy as differing, I don't think that's correct. You're saying that over the last 20 years, life expectancy has increased something like 5 years, healthy life expectancy has increased 4 years, therefore we've got a widening gap. I think that's actually the reverse of the truth. Because take a simple example. If you've got a world in which you've got, say, life expectancy is 70 and healthy life expectancy is 60 in the absence of infant mortality, then if you killed 10% of the infants, you'd reduce life expectancy by 1/10, so you'd lose 7 years off life expectancy. You'd reduce healthy life expectancy by 1/6, so you'd knock 6 years off healthy life expectancy. Well, you shouldn't describe that as a diminution of the prevalence of disability, and yet you've done the reverse. If you just reduce early mortality, you would increase life expectancy by more than you increase healthy life expectancy. Just if you took a random sample of the population and shot them, you'd actually achieve what you're describing as a compression of morbidity. But it's a really wrong interpretation of the numbers you've got. They're driven by changes in mortality. And there isn't any evidence in what you put up of an expansion in morbidity. It just isn't there. It's a wrong interpretation.
Hold that.
That's a question.
Hold. Thank you for that clarification. I think I had second person up there. Thank you.
Hello, I'm David Edwards, Public Health Registrar from the East of England. A point has been made already, but I think it's really worth emphasising that when we're talking about the global burden of disease in the UK and elsewhere, it's not just and drivers for policy change. There is an opportunity, I think, given the limitations of data, to look at the economic impacts, but not just from a health system point of view, but also the loss, opportunity cost for people who are no longer able to support their families or themselves, and also the burden that puts on their families or others in society in looking after them. I'd like your thoughts on that, Duncan Selby.
Thank you. So can we take our third question over here? Thank you.
Mark Haggard, University of Cambridge. This is a question. And there have been 4 mentions from the platform, and there are several allusions in the academic caution in the written articles in the special issue about the way in which the disability weights were worked out. And we've heard that there is an evolving research agenda, as I understood it, on that very issue. So my 2 aspects of my question are, A, will the mega model be rerun with new data in parts of it, let's say after 2 or 3 years, rather than waiting for 10 years? And B, in that evolving research agenda, is the consortium open to new members? And if so, how do we join?
That was a pretty good plug. And the fourth one, who's got the fourth one was over there. There was a... Actually, I think it was a lady behind.
Dan Wickler, Harvard School of Public Health. So it's a question for Josh, but anybody else also. So the public is going to ask whether you're saying this has been a good thing or a bad thing, and the governments are going to ask which way does this suggest that we try to go. So take something like what's the progress of neonatal intensive care, in which the earlier and earlier, younger and younger premature babies are rescued, but with each advance, it turns out the younger they are, the more of them are going to be seriously disabled for a lifetime. Now, that creates a disproportional share of years spent with disability in the population. If you didn't do that, presumably the picture would be more favorable because because they account for such a disproportionate share, although they're not large in numbers. Now, is the message for governments that this is not a good thing to do for that reason, and similarly for other kinds of sources of disability over a lifetime?
Thank you. So let's go to our panel, I think principally to our primary speakers. Let's deal with it. Let's just go out randomly and shoot people question first, shall we?
Okay, in some sense, Sir Richard Pito's question and the questions that Dan Wickler just asked are related, which is, how do we interpret these changes in life expectancy and healthy life expectancy and the relationship between the two in terms of their implications and how we view these as positive changes or negative changes or something more mixed? And I think I agree with Sir Richard's question in the suggestion that the change that we're pointing to really is driven by the mortality change, and I think it's fair to say that the interpretation can be made in various ways, and we've struggled with that a little bit. But let me say what I think is an interpretation of it that is unambiguous. And that is that the mortality changes, even if they're driving this response in terms of the overall morbidity in the population, do have very clear implications for the total volume of morbidity in the sense of the years that the population can expect to live with less than good health. And so even if mortality is the major driver, I think it is the case unambiguously that as we reduce mortality, add years to the end of life, and those are the years where the prevalence of disabling conditions is highest, then that overall volume will change. I think we've gone back and forth about whether that's good news for people or bad news, and I think your question and Dan Wickler's question has highlighted some of the perils of trying to label these normatively in that way. But I think when we point to what are the implications for the healthcare system in terms of an aging population and the consequences of that that will be expressed in the increase in disability, that much is clear. And whether you call that a success or a failure or a challenge or good news or bad news, I think it's clear that will place extraordinary demands on healthcare systems in terms of the costs that they face. It will place extraordinary demands on societies in terms of other costs. And so, I think there is a challenge in interpretation, and I accept the challenge as to whether we have cast that quite right. But I think that aspect of it is fairly unambiguous.
Yeah, responding to Mark's question about the agenda, it started asking about the agenda around the disability weights, but more broadly about the whole enterprise. There are plans to not just wait another 3 years and then rerun the whole caboodle and make new estimates, but to continuously update what we have. Because we now have such a precious resource of all this information collated with all the methods that are matching the information that we have, that it would be a loss if we would just leave it sit and would have to restart in a number of years. So there are plans to continuously update, and if there's a need to do every month, produce new figures, but certainly at an annual cycle of trying to troll through all the different elements of this work. And your pro bono offer of assistance will be noted. We've managed to cajole 400 odd people into the current enterprise. We certainly won't shy away from abusing more people.
Interestingly, one of those 400 people chased me across Sydney Airport about 3 days ago to give me a little bit of feedback about the disability weights. So this is clearly an issue that people feel very strongly about. What I'm going to do, we essentially had an extension of two questions which can go a little further in relation to, I think, the burden on society, the economic impacts, but also the broader question about governance. I might just ask any member of the panel if they'd like to make a comment in respect of that particular combination of questions, including our discussants.
I'm happy. I thought that was
Please.
I wish I'd made more of the point about it's about more than health services, and health is more than about what we do in terms of treatment. I mentioned ever so briefly the importance of prevention and early intervention, but I could have gone on to give equal weight to the importance of employment and having a job, somewhere to live, decent and warm, and doing something about the growing social isolation of people in this country. And all of these are matters best addressed at a local level within a national context, and why in England we're passing over to local government, to political leadership, the responsibility, because that's where, for improving health, because that's where the responsibility lies for economic regeneration and for housing and planning and this sort of thing. And our ambition is to create 152 mayors of New York in England, all absolutely focused on improving the population of their people.
Other members? Mickey,
I'd like to follow up
please.
on Richard's point. I mean, the figure 5 in the Hale paper, which breaks down the contributions of changes in disability, 2157. Changes in child mortality, changes in adult mortality. And you see that, at least for the high-income countries, most of the gain in healthy life expectancy has not been from declines in child mortality, but from declines in adult mortality. So it's not a case of deaths that are not associated with morbidity, perhaps in early life, declining and thereby producing an increase. It's happened in spite of the fact that the decline in mortality has been from causes which presumably are associated with morbidity, as distinct from people being shot.
I think the same comment applies, though.
Okay.
So there was, for those who are not sitting close to the front, there was a head shake and a discussion to be had over lunch. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take two more questions. I'm conscious it is nearly lunchtime. So hand up fast if you're interested. There's a gentleman just here on the corridor. Stick your hand way up in the air if you want to ask a question. There's one. Anybody else? Yes, a lady up there on the back. She gets the second one. Please.
Hi. Tony Wolf from the Bone and Joint Decade. The global increase in disability from 1990 to 2010 is predicted to increase, particularly for musculoskeletal, for example, by 45%. Is that expected to be the same in all regions of the globe? Because obviously that means there are policy implications that perhaps Duncan would like to consider.
Okay, thank you. And we'll take that second question from the lady up the back. Has she got the microphone?
Yes. Thank you. Maria Victoria Zunzunegui, Université de Montréal.
And we can't hear you, I'm sorry.
You can hear me now? Okay. I would like to ask you if there is any reflection on gender issues, because you have been presenting sex-specific data, but most of this data could be very affected by gender. And to give you an example, with the weighting of disability, the impact of many chronic conditions is different for men and women, and the disability gap between men and women changes widely across the world.
Thank you.
On the question about the musculoskeletal conditions, whether that applies the same across all regions. Well, first of all, that increase that you talk about of 45% is with flat rates of disease for the musculoskeletal disorders. So it's driven by the overall increase in population size and aging of the population. And so the variation between different parts of the world will be driven by variations in the process of aging.
Okay.
And just a word on the question about different disability weights by gender. I think to the extent that there are differences in the health consequences of different causes of disease and injury by gender, a large part of that really needs to be captured in the epidemiologic estimation. And part of that includes the estimation of the distribution of cases of, say, back pain across different severity levels, mild, moderate, and severe. To the extent that we've done that correctly, that can actually capture if there are important gender differences in the experience of severity for a particular condition. And then there's not a need to have weights that are specific to gender. In general, that sort of is consistent with our design principle, which is that the disability weights should be attached to a relatively homogeneous outcome. And we should do our best to describe that outcome as validly as possible. And one of the ways that I hinted at where we see the possibility moving forward is to disaggregate more the range of health states that can be associated with a particular sequela, and to build very much the empirical basis for estimating the distribution of cases for sequela across the array of relevant health states. And so I see that as an agenda moving forward. I think perhaps if we do a good job at that, we'll have addressed some of these concerns about capturing variation in subpopulations that may be masked by an insufficiently disaggregated look at health states now.
Yeah, maybe just to add to that, the overall graph of the summation of all disability that I showed indicates that the overall disability experience at most ages is a bit higher for women than for men, and that's driven by a number of very prominent causes of disability where the prevalence of disease is considerably higher in women than in men. Of course, there are also exceptions where men have higher rates, but in particular things like depression and anxiety, we estimate about 50% higher prevalence, and that adds to the greater disability experience in women.
Thank you. We come therefore to the conclusion of this session. Can I finish with one piece of housekeeping? Lunch is from 12:30 to 1:15. Could I ask people to be back at 1:15 on the grounds? I think you can see there's so much interest, and any time we lose getting back into the room is a time lost from questions. Can I ask you, though, to thank our speakers, Theo Voss, Joshua Solomon, and our discussants. And bon appetit.